The courtroom was full. She walked in alone. Bloody lip. Hands cuffed. They said she was the threat, but no one mentioned what the cop did to her. No one cared what she filmed. Until a woman in the back row quietly stood up and changed everything. What happens when the person they tried to humiliate is the daughter of someone trained to take them down? If you believe in quiet justice, tap like this story will make you feel it. I remember the sound of her shoes more than anything else. That soft shuffle of rubber soles on tile as they brought her into courtroom B, the smallest one with the peeling paint and the broken clock above the judge's bench that hadn't worked in years. Nobody noticed her at first. She was just a girl, small frame, hands cuffed in front, quiet. 15, they said. Her name was Amira Dawson. They said she caused a disturbance at the mall, that she interfered with police work. But what she really did, what brought her into that courtroom on a Wednesday morning, was film officer Travis Beckett pushing an old black man to the ground. No warning, no explanation, just force. Amira didn't run. She didn't even raise her voice. She pulled out her phone and recorded, and a few thousand people watched that clip online before someone made sure she paid for it. When they walked her in, it wasn't with drama or shouting, just stillness, the kind of silence that says the room had already made up its mind. You could feel it in the way people looked at her, like a decision had been reached before the judge ever entered. Officer Beckett stood near the witness table, arms folded, staring. He didn't try to hide the contempt on his face. He looked at her the way men look at something they believe should have stayed in its place. I didn't know him personally, but I recognized the type. Amira didn't meet his stare. She sat quietly beside her public defender, a young attorney flipping through a folder like he didn't expect to find much in it. She didn't speak. She didn't fidget. And when Beckett started walking toward her, slow and deliberate, I thought he was coming to clarify something, maybe to speak to the judge. But he didn't look at the judge. He looked only at her. He leaned in, whispered something I couldn't hear. Maybe no one could. But Amira didn't flinch. Her face stayed still, calm, unreadable. That's when it happened. Beckett lifted his arm and slapped her. A full, sharp slap across the face, loud enough to echo against the walls and make my heart stop. And for a second, nobody moved. Not the judge, not the bailiff, not even the defense attorney sitting inches away. The courtroom froze, not in confusion, but in fear, or worse, indifference. I remember turning my head toward the bench, waiting for Judge Roland Keene to react. But he didn't even blink. He just kept his eyes on whatever paper was in front of him, as if nothing had happened. The bailiff glanced over, hesitated, then settled back into stillness. Like they were all waiting to see if someone else would move first. And Amira, she turned her head back slowly. Blood had started to gather on her lower lip, but she didn't touch it right away. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just studied Beckett like she was memorizing something about him. Then calmly, with the kind of stillness that made my chest tighten, she raised her cuffed hands and wiped the blood from her mouth. And she said, clear but quiet, "You just made it federal." Those 5 words dropped heavier than the slap. Beckett stepped back, not because anyone told him to, but because something in her voice shook him. Maybe it was how sure she sounded. Maybe it was because in that moment she wasn't just a girl in cuffs. She was something else. Then from the back row a woman moved, just slightly. She reached for her wrist and adjusted her watch, a smooth, practiced gesture. She didn't look up, didn't speak, just turned the bezel with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. Her posture was casual, her eyes unreadable. But there was something about her, something I couldn't name, that told me she wasn't there by accident. She hadn't gasped when Amira was hit. She hadn't stood up or shouted. She didn't need to. And in that moment, I felt it. The shift. The quiet rearrangement of power in the room. Like the story we all thought we were watching was never really the story at all. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. This was a setup. And someone, maybe all of us, was about to learn who the real witness had been all along. After the slap, after that eerie silence settled over the courtroom like a sheet of dust, things moved again, but not in the direction they should have. Beckett returned to the witness stand like nothing had happened. No apology, no hesitation. He straightened his uniform, adjusted the mic, and launched into a version of the story that twisted everything sideways. According to him, Amira Dawson wasn't a calm girl who pulled out her phone when she saw something wrong. She was aggressive. She interfered with a lawful arrest. She became verbally combative. She resisted detainment. That was how he put it. Resisted. Like she was a threat. Like he was the one who had to defend himself. He spoke slowly, clearly, with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing the system will back you. Every word he spoke was neat, rehearsed, almost like he was reading from a training manual. And still no one interrupted him. The Assistant District Attorney, Eliza Mathers, sat at the opposite end of the room, legs crossed neatly at the ankle, a legal pad resting on her lap, though she barely glanced at it. Blonde hair tucked tight behind her ears, pearl earrings glinting under the dim court lights. She had the look of someone who had done this 100 times and planned to do it 100 more. When Beckett finished his statement, she didn't ask a single question, didn't press for clarification. She simply nodded. A small gesture, not even toward the judge, just to herself, as if what he said was obvious, expected, not worth examining any further. Then she looked across the room at Amira, not with concern, not even with contempt, just indifference. And something about that look chilled me more than the slap ever could. Judge Keene finally moved. He picked up a pen and began writing. Slowly. Methodically. He didn't ask Amira if she had anything to say. He didn't address her at all. He didn't even look in her direction. Not once. Just scribbled a few lines into the docket, clicked the pen shut, and handed the form to the clerk like he was finishing up a grocery list. From where I sat, Amira looked so small. Not because of her size, but because of how they treated her, like she was already erased. Like the outcome had been stamped on her forehead before she ever walked in. I kept thinking someone would say something. Riley Tran, the public defender assigned to her case, shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, and opened his mouth, but then closed it again. Maybe he was new. Maybe he'd seen this happen before and knew how it usually ended. Or maybe he just didn't think anyone would listen. He reached over and whispered something to Amira, barely audible. She didn't reply. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor in front of her, as if the tiles had something to say that no one else in the room was willing to speak aloud. And behind her, still in the back row, the woman who had adjusted her watch earlier now held a notepad. She wasn't typing on a phone. She wasn't filming. She was writing by hand, slow and steady. I couldn't see the words, but her posture told me everything. Calm, sharp, intentional. Her face didn't shift, didn't blink at the obvious injustice unfolding in front of her. But there was something in her presence and how still she sat while the room rearranged itself into something cruel and familiar that made me start to realize she had been expecting this. She hadn't come as a bystander. She was there for a reason. And still nobody in power noticed her. Not Judge Keene. Not Ada Mathers. Not even Beckett, who by now had folded his hands on the table like he had finished a good day's work. Amira's wrists were still cuffed. The blood on her lip had dried, darkened slightly. She hadn't moved. She hadn't asked to speak. But you could feel something building in the quiet around her. Like her silence wasn't just silence. It was a position, a plan, a pause before something none of us were ready for. The courtroom lights hummed overhead. The clock above the judge's bench stayed broken, and I realized I was holding my breath again, waiting, hoping someone would break the script we were all stuck inside. But nobody did. Not yet. I thought that might be it. That they'd close the book and call it a day with Amira's silence as their final page. But then something shifted. Riley Tran stood up. His voice was steady, but you could tell it wasn't used to filling a courtroom. Still, he spoke, asking for a chance to present new evidence. A video. Civilian footage from a store across the street from the incident. It had a timestamp. It showed the moment Beckett shoved the elderly man, and more importantly, it showed Amira stepping in. Not yelling, not pushing, just holding out her arms like a barrier. A child protecting someone 3 times her age. He explained all that while plugging in the flash drive. The clerk brought over a monitor. The judge didn't look interested. The ADA was barely paying attention. But I leaned forward. So did a few others. And when the screen came to life, grainy and distant, but clear enough to see what mattered, You could feel something small stir in the room. The man in the video had a cane. He moved slowly, clearly, confused, clearly frightened. Beckett's body language was tense, aggressive. He said something we couldn't hear, then shoved the old man hard in the chest. The man stumbled, and Amira appeared stepping between them, not attacking, just placing herself in the space where no one else would go. She caught him, then stood still. That was it. And for a moment, just one, the room held its breath. But then Judge Keene leaned back and waved a hand without even looking up. He called the footage unverified, said it lacked legal confirmation, claimed it couldn't be used as evidence. Riley tried to argue, but the judge cut him off, dismissed the video, just like that, as if it had never been shown at all. A.D. Mathers gave a tiny smile, a private one, like someone reacting to an inside joke. Then she said softly, almost sweetly, that it was a nice clip, but nice footage doesn't mean anything in court. The screen went dark. The monitor was unplugged, and the courtroom swallowed that brief flicker of truth like it was nothing, like it never mattered. A woman behind me exhaled sharply, then went quiet. Nobody else reacted, not loudly at least. There were no protests, no outrage, just a kind of collective disappointment that settled in the walls and floors and people's bones. That was when Officer Beckett leaned slightly toward the man seated behind him. A colleague in uniform, Officer Dean Harlow, who had been silent the entire time, arms crossed, lips pressed into a hard line. Beckett whispered something with a small shake of his head. "She won't last long, that's what I heard." And something in the way he said it made my stomach turn. Because it wasn't about the trial anymore. It was about breaking her, about wearing her down until the silence she carried so carefully cracked under pressure. But Amira didn't move. She didn't react. Her gaze stayed on the empty monitor where her defense had just been erased. She didn't look to her lawyer or the judge or the jury. She looked at no one. And yet she wasn't alone. In the back, the same woman who had written calmly during the last part of the hearing was now watching intently. Lorraine Pierce. Still saying nothing. Still revealing nothing. But her eyes narrowed slightly as the video was dismissed. She reached down and touched the side of her watch again. A quick, controlled gesture. Not dramatic. Not accidental. It was the only movement she made, but it spoke volumes. I don't know if anyone else saw it. They were too busy watching the screen go black or watching the judge pretend none of it had weight. But I saw her. And in that quiet, deliberate gesture, I felt something shift again. Not in the courtroom, not yet. But somewhere just beneath it. Something had been marked. The law had spoken. The court had decided what mattered and what didn't. But the truth had been shown, if only briefly. And that image of a child stepping in to protect someone when no one else would had been burned into more than just the pixels of a forgotten screen. It had settled somewhere deeper. And I had the feeling that Lorraine, whoever she was, hadn't just come to watch it happen. She had come to remember who looked away. And maybe, just maybe, to make sure someone paid for it later. Just when the room had started to sink back into a tired rhythm. The door creaked open again and Officer Dean Harlow stepped in. He didn't make a sound beyond his boots on the floor. No announcement. No rush. Just a quiet presence that somehow made the air tighten. He walked toward the bench with a folded slip of paper in hand and told the clerk that he was there to conduct a standard evidence check on the defendant's personal items. No one asked why. No one questioned the timing. Judge Keene didn't even look up from the stack of papers in front of him. He just nodded once, barely noticeable. Ada Mathers didn't blink. She didn't need to. That kind of silence was its own permission. Harlow turned to the defense table, and Officer Beckett joined him like he'd been waiting for this moment. No one summoned him. He just moved smooth and steady, a man stepping back into the role he knew too well. Riley, seated beside Amira, reached for her backpack and held it close. His voice was calm but strained as he asked what the officers were expecting to find. Harlow didn't answer. Beckett didn't look at him. Instead, Mathers responded from her seat with the flat, detached tone of someone rehearsed in power. She said they were simply following standard procedure, that any complaints could be filed later. Later. It was always later. Beckett reached across the table and took the bag. Not aggressively, just confidently, as though resistance would be out of place in a room like this. He placed it down in front of them, opened it wide, and began pulling things out piece by piece. It started orderly. A few notebooks, a pencil pouch, a folder. But that order unraveled quickly. Pages were opened and shaken loose. Homework sheets fluttered to the floor. A wrapped sandwich landed with a dull thud and was left there. A water bottle was opened, sniffed, and tossed aside. Harlow unzipped the smaller compartments, upending the contents without a glance. Colored pencils spilled. A photo with bent corners was flicked off the edge of the table. One officer stepped on a paper without noticing. No one said a word. Riley sat frozen, his mouth half open. Then he stood and raised his voice slightly, trying again to object. But Mathers cut him off without looking up. "They're doing their job," she said. That was all. Across the room, a juror shifted in his seat. A woman in the gallery looked down at her hands. And behind me, someone murmured something under their breath but didn't finish the sentence. Because what was there to say? Amira had not moved. Her hands were still cuffed in her lap. She watched quietly as her life was emptied onto a table and sorted like debris. When they finished, the table looked like it had been scavenged, not searched. Then, without waiting for instruction, Amira stood. She walked over to her belongings, still calm, still quiet. She bent down and picked up the sandwich first, folded it back into the foil as best she could, and placed it gently into the bag. One by one, she gathered the papers, the pens, the scattered pieces of herself. She straightened a crumpled page, slipped a photograph back into a folder. Her movements were slow, but deliberate, like she was reclaiming something that wasn't meant to be touched in the first place. She didn't look at anyone. No one offered help, not the officers, not her attorney, not the judge, and no one watching stood either. When she returned to her seat, she zipped the backpack with a hand that trembled only once, barely enough to notice. In the back row, Lorraine Pierce had not moved. She had not spoken, but her eyes, steady and unblinking, had followed every motion with quiet precision. Her notebook remained closed. Her pen rested still beside it. When Amira sat back down, Lorraine raised her wrist slightly and tapped the side of her watch. Once. Then again. 2 quick silent taps. There was no response. No reaction. Just the faintest glint of reflection off the metal face. But to those who knew what to look for, the signal had been sent. The courtroom continued as if nothing had happened. Judge Keene scribbled another note. Mathers crossed her legs and checked her file. Harlow and Beckett returned to their seats with blank faces. The clerk rearranged a stack of folders, and Amira sat motionless beside her half-packed bag, eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. But something about the stillness had changed. Something had been violated that couldn't be erased with paperwork or protocol. And somewhere in that quiet, a line had been drawn. Not by the court. By someone else. Someone who had been waiting for this exact moment to begin. For a while, the room stayed quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind that feels heavy. The kind that hums just beneath your skin like something's waiting to break. Amira hadn't moved since she repacked her bag. Her hands were folded neatly on top of it now, fingers locked, still cuffed. Her back was straight, her gaze fixed on a spot just past the clerk's desk. She wasn't blinking much. She wasn't looking at anyone. Then almost casually, she slid her right hand inside the front pouch of her backpack. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Not hiding. Just careful. When her hand came back up, she held a small folded piece of paper between 2 fingers. Without glancing sideways, without adjusting her posture, she passed it to Riley. He blinked at it, hesitated, then took it. He unfolded it quickly like he was expecting a list or a question. But there were only a few words written in careful, tiny handwriting. "Don't act. They're watching. I'm ready." His eyes scanned it again, slower this time. Then they lifted to her face. She didn't look at him. Not even a flick of attention. She just sat there, breathing steady. Riley looked confused, maybe even a little unsettled. He shifted in his seat, cleared his throat, glanced around as if trying to read the room again. Then something in her wrist caught his eye. The watch. It had been there the whole time, mostly hidden by her sleeve. He leaned just slightly enough to see it more clearly. It wasn't a kid's smartwatch. It wasn't cheap or flashy. It was a matte black band with a metal clasp thick enough to look purposeful but simple enough not to attract attention. There was no logo, no color, and no way that watch had come from a store in the mall. He narrowed his eyes, thinking, and for just a second, The sound of the courtroom faded in the background as something flickered across his memory. An old case file, maybe, or a training lecture he'd half forgotten about specialized equipment issued to agents working in covert environments, civilian-looking gear with embedded tech, emergency signaling tools disguised as ordinary objects, watches, exactly like that one. Amira still hadn't moved. Riley opened his mouth to ask something, then hesitated. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Who's watching?" There was a long pause, and then slowly Amira turned her head. It was the first time all morning she had turned her head for anyone. Her eyes met Riley's just for a breath. There was no fear in them, no panic. Only something sharper, something older, a kind of knowing he didn't understand yet. Then she looked away, but not randomly. She turned toward the gallery, toward the back row, toward the woman in the dark blazer who had been still as stone since the hearing began. For the first time since entering the room, Amira met her mother's gaze, and Lorraine Pierce met it back. There was no nod, no signal, no emotion flickering across her face, just a connection. Brief, direct, quietly electric. And then Amira turned away again, eyes back to the front face, unreadable once more. But the moment had happened, and everyone who caught it knew it meant something. Riley didn't speak again. He didn't unfold the note a second time. He slipped it into his jacket pocket and sat still like someone who had just realized they were part of something much larger than they thought. And me, I felt something shift under my skin, like the air was no longer just watching this girl. It was holding its breath. Because for the first time since she entered the courtroom, Amira Dawson was no longer alone. And whatever came next wasn't going to wait much longer. For a long while, Amira sat still. The courtroom settled again into that tight, controlled quiet that had blanketed everything since the hearing began. Pages turned softly. A cough from someone in the gallery. The distant click of a clerk's pen. Nothing loud. Nothing meaningful. Then Beckett leaned forward. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't even move his mouth much. But his voice carried just enough for Amira to hear it, and just enough for me to catch the edge of it too. "No one's here for you. Not even your mother." The words were designed to cut beneath the skin, quiet enough to avoid notice, but sharp enough to wound. It wasn't a threat. It was a dismissal, a claim of victory before the battle was over. Amira didn't blink. She didn't look at him. She just sat there. But something in the room shifted, and it started with a chair. It was soft at first, just the faint scrape of polished wood sliding backward on tile. But in the silence, it rang out like a warning. A single chair, far in the back of the room, moved by a woman who had not spoken, not shifted, not reacted since the trial began. Lorraine Pierce stood slowly, not with anger, not with panic, but with an unsettling calm that made the entire back row turn toward her before she had even taken her first step. She walked down the aisle like she had all the time in the world. One step, then another. There was no rush in her movement, no urgency, just the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where she was going, and exactly what she was about to do. People leaned forward, some held their breath, and still no one said a word, until she reached the center of the room. Judge Keene looked up for the first time in minutes. His eyes squinted, slightly confused at first, then concerned. "Ma'am, please return to your seat." His voice tried to hold authority, but it wavered. Just slightly. Just enough to show that something in her presence had already unsettled him. Lorraine didn't stop. She stepped forward into the open space between the benches, and the bar lifted her hand slowly and reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. There was a flicker of hesitation across a few faces in the room. Even Beckett's shoulders stiffened. Then Lorraine pulled out a small black case. It clicked open in her hand, and that was when the silence in the room turned from uncomfortable to electric. Inside the case sat a federal badge, not local, not state, but engraved, sealed, and unmistakably real. Lorraine raised her voice for the first time. Not loud, but steady. Agent Lorraine Pierce, Central Intelligence Agency, Division of Internal Oversight. The words landed like stone dropped into still water. They didn't echo. They didn't need to. They simply arrived, and everything else stopped. The judge didn't speak. Mathers dropped her pen. The clerk froze mid-turn. Someone in the gallery exhaled too loudly and then covered their mouth as if they had spoken out of turn. Beckett didn't move. Neither did Harlow. And Amira, seated quietly at the table, still cuffed, looked straight ahead without turning. As if none of this surprised her. As if she had always known this moment would come. Lorraine remained standing, holding the badge calmly in her hand. There was no dramatic speech, no sudden outburst, just presence, undeniable, unapologetic, unmistakable. I remember feeling something in my chest loosen and tighten all at once, like a thread that had been pulled for too long had finally snapped. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was full, heavy with the knowledge that things were not as they seemed, that the story everyone thought they were watching had just rewritten itself mid-sentence. Judge Keene opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. His fingers tapped the side of the bench once, twice, then stopped. Lorraine said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her presence had already done the talking, and in that stillness, in that moment when the courtroom held its breath, something finally broke. Not loudly, but irreversibly. Lorraine Pierce did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She opened the folder in her hand and spoke as if reading from a list of debts the room had long chosen to ignore. 4 years ago, Officer Travis Beckett used force against a 14-year-old boy during a routine stop in the Kingsbury district. The boy's shoulder was dislocated. He was unarmed. No arrest was made. The complaint was filed. Charges were dismissed. The incident was marked closed, but the file remains. She turned a page, calm and steady. 3 years ago, Officer Dean Harlow was implicated in the removal of seized narcotics from an evidence locker. Surveillance footage was lost. The chain of custody flagged. Internal Affairs requested review. ADA Eliza Mathers declined prosecution, citing insufficient verification. She turned another page. Last year, a civilian minor, female, black, age 15, was named as a key witness in a local abuse investigation involving both Beckett and Harlow. The minor retracted her statement after repeated contact with the officers in question. Her parents filed a formal complaint. Judge Roland Keene ruled the claim inadmissible. The case was dismissed before hearing. Lorraine closed the file with a soft but final motion. All 3 cases were scheduled for judicial review in this courthouse. All 3 were denied the chance to be heard. Her voice did not waver. It did not rise. It simply landed where it was meant to. She looked toward the bench, blocked by the office of this judge, silenced by the hand of this prosecutor. Mathers' voice cracked slightly when it came. This isn't relevant to the matter. Lorraine didn't turn her head. She just answered. Covering crimes is always relevant. That was the moment the courtroom shifted, not with noise, but with breath. With the kind of silence that comes when people realize something bigger than the case in front of them is being peeled back. Slowly, deliberately, Lorraine stepped forward and placed a second document on the clerk's desk. Its seal shimmered faintly under the courtroom light. Federal orders, issued at 6:28 this morning. Authorization for immediate detainment. Signed by Oversight and Internal Bureau Review. The judge didn't move. Then the side door opened. 2 men in dark suits entered. No words, no fanfare, just calm, practiced movement that made the room sit straighter. One turned toward Beckett, the other toward Harlow. Beckett stood too fast, his chair scraping sharply behind him. His hands hovered in confusion. His eyes darted to the judge, but Keene said nothing. Harlow half rose from his chair, his mouth tightening into protest. The agent behind him moved first. His hand found the wrist, a twist, a pair of cuffs clicked into place. Gasps scattered through the gallery. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Another man covered his mouth, whispering finally. A juror leaned forward, forgetting to hide his curiosity. A woman 2 rows behind me wiped her eyes. And Amira. She sat motionless, watching the scene unfold like a script she already knew by heart. Mathers did not speak. The judge's hand hovered above the gavel as if he had just remembered he had one, and now didn't know how to use it. Lorraine did not look at the officers. She looked at Keene, and he looked back. There was something broken in his expression, not shattered but fractured. A man realizing that the room no longer belonged to him. The agents escorted Beckett and Harlow through the aisle. No one tried to stop them. Not the prosecutor, not the bailiff, not even the judge. The cuffs shimmered under the courtroom lights like a kind of reckoning. When the men were gone, Lorraine turned back toward her daughter. Amira didn't smile. She didn't nod, but her eyes found Lorraine's, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. Not triumph, not vengeance, but clarity. The courtroom was no longer watching her as a problem. They were watching her as a mirror, and justice, quiet, deliberate and long delayed, had finally found its voice. For a few long seconds, the courtroom held its breath. The cuffs were gone, but the silence remained, not heavy like before, not paralyzing. This time it felt like something was holding steady before shifting entirely. Riley glanced toward the judge, then toward the monitor, and spoke in a voice that didn't need volume to carry weight. Your Honor, I request that the video previously dismissed be submitted again for the court to review. It has now been verified and certified by federal authority. Judge Keene stayed frozen. His fingers twitched against the arm of his chair. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no, but he didn't stop it either. Riley turned to the clerk and the screen came to life. This time, it wasn't a blurry clip or an informal piece of footage. In the top corner, a clean watermark glowed in white. In the bottom, a digital timestamp ticked forward. And in between, the truth unfolded again. An elderly black man stumbled into frame. He moved slowly, confused. His hands were up. His voice was faint, but he wasn't a threat. Beckett stepped forward, shoulders squared, and shoved him hard in the chest. The old man rocked backward. And then, without hesitation, Amira entered the frame. She didn't yell. She didn't push. She didn't do anything loud. She simply placed herself between the officer and the man, arms out, body still like a human shield. A child standing where no adult had. The clip ended in silence. But this time the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of recognition. Judge Keene stared at the screen for a long moment. His face was unreadable. His mouth stayed closed. The courtroom waited, but no one looked to him for guidance anymore. Lorraine took one step forward. This isn't justice, it's damage control. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It arrived with the force of something long held back. She looked not at the judge, not at Mathers, but across the entire room. What you just saw wasn't a mistake. It was a system working exactly as it was designed to, until someone refused to move. She didn't say Amira's name, she didn't have to. A ripple moved through the crowd. A woman near the back clutched her bag tighter, then slowly rose to her feet. A man followed. Then two more. Then a row. Then the gallery. Quietly. Without discussion. As if the act of standing was the only way to make sense of what they had just seen. They didn't stand for protest. They stood for truth. Amira sat still. Her hands rested on her lap. The cuffs had been removed, but the weight of them still lingered in the room. And yet she did not look small anymore. She looked steady. Riley returned to her side. He didn't say a word, just stood there shoulder to shoulder. She placed both feet flat on the floor, her back straight, eyes fixed on no one in particular. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She didn't thank the room for seeing her, because this moment wasn't about gratitude. It was about recognition. And then, from behind the last bench, a phone clicked into position. A young reporter who had been silent the entire hearing leaned forward just slightly. Camera raised, not hidden, not ashamed. The light blinked red. The world was about to see what this courtroom had tried to bury. Lorraine turned not to the judge, but to the people now standing shoulder to shoulder behind the benches. It was never about who shouts loudest. It's about who refuses to look away. No one sat back down. And the judge, he sat motionless, not in resistance, in realization that whatever power he once held in that room had been quietly stripped away. Not by force, but by truth. As Amira stood, Riley took a small step aside. She didn't raise her arms. She didn't wave. She simply walked past the defense table, slow and quiet, through the middle of the room toward the light of the hallway. And as she walked, the silence walked with her. Because sometimes the loudest verdict is the one no one dares to speak aloud. And in that moment, no one doubted who had won. When Amira stepped into the sunlight, the world didn't roar. There were no flashing lights, no loud questions, no roaring crowds, just the quiet rhythm of her footsteps on stone and the whisper of wind moving between the columns. The courthouse doors creaked open behind her, but no one followed. No bailiff, no officer, not even a glance from the judge. Lorraine walked beside her, steady and silent, not leading and not protecting, just being there. They descended the steps without hesitation, not rushing, not hiding, as if walking out of that building was something they had been ready to do long before anyone else realized the trial was already over. A small crowd had gathered, but no one spoke right away. They simply made space. Some watched in stunned silence. Others looked down, unsure what to do with their hands or their eyes. The moment held. And then through it, a voice broke the stillness. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. She didn't yell, and still changed everything. The words came from a little girl no older than 10 standing by her mother's side. Her braids were pulled tight. Her jacket was patched at the shoulder with a butterfly. She didn't smile when she said it. She just stared with a kind of wonder that children have when they recognize truth before adults are ready to name it. Amira turned slightly, met the girl's eyes, and gave a small nod. That was enough. From the crowd, a journalist stepped forward carefully. Microphone lowered, voice gentle. Why didn't you fight back? Amira paused. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she knew how much weight the moment carried. She let the silence hang, let it breathe. Then, as if sharing something that didn't need to be loud to be heard, she said, because sometimes silence isn't fear, it's strategy. No one clapped. No one needed to. The wind picked up slightly, carrying her words out into the open. That was all it took. Within an hour, a clip of the quote was posted online. By midday, it had been shared across timelines, screens, and platforms not usually reserved for court cases. Grandmothers reposted it under family portraits. Teachers wrote it on whiteboards in classrooms. Activists added it to murals. And quietly, without a press team or a campaign, Amira's name began trending. But the attention didn't come as celebration. It came as recognition. Not of a moment, but of a movement already lived, silent, slow, and finally seen. Inside the courthouse, the shift continued. Ada, Eliza Mathers, exited through a back door. Her hands were empty, her eyes down. She left without a word, no closing argument, no press release. And yet her silence felt heavier than anything she had said that day. Within 48 hours, her name would be missing from the prosecutor's directory. Her resignation would be brief and unexplained. But screenshots of her expression in court had already circulated widely. In the judge's chamber, Roland Keene sat alone, his gavel untouched, his bench stripped of the power it once carried. He would stay behind long after the last voice had left the building, as if hoping the silence might somehow speak in his defense. But it didn't. And by the following week, a formal ethics inquiry would be underway, filed not by the CIA, not by a defense attorney, but by his own court clerk, who had sat through every hearing unnoticed. As for Beckett and Harlow, they spent the night in separate holding cells. No badges, no belts, no press, no protection. Harlow tried to protest during intake. Beckett kept his jaw clenched the whole time, but neither resisted. Not really, because they knew the sound of silence now too. And they knew that in this case it meant no one was coming. Back in Lorraine's small living room, Amira curled into the corner of the couch, shoes off, legs folded under her. The TV was off. No social media, no scrolling, just stillness. Lorraine sat beside her arm, stretched behind her shoulders, but not pulling her close. It was the kind of silence only people who understood each other could share. Outside, the noise was rising. Clips of the courtroom, photos of Amira standing still, replays of her calm voice answering the question the world couldn't stop asking. Why didn't you yell? And her answer kept coming back. Because silence isn't fear, it's strategy. Some called her brave. Some called her brilliant. Most just called her by her name. Not defendant. Not girl in the video. Just Amira. The one who never yelled. And never had to. It began with a moment most people would have missed. A quiet smile, not posed, not rehearsed. Just the soft curve of Amira's lips as she stepped away from the courthouse. Her shoulders loose. Her eyes steady. The image lasted less than a second. But someone captured it. And someone else gave it words. This is what dignity looks like. By morning, the clip had reached more than 6 million people. News anchors replayed it without commentary. Writers called it the moment the system blinked. One headline read, "The trial that ended with a whisper." Another simply said, "The girl who never had to yell." In the days that followed, the noise grew louder around her, but not inside her. Commentators debated, students quoted her, and families brought her name into conversations that had been silent too long. But Amira remained still. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't post. She didn't try to explain herself again. She had already spoken. 1 week later, she walked into her new school. A different hallway. A different crowd. No fanfare, no security, no cameras. Just a girl with a backpack and a steady pace. Her hair was pulled back, her sweater plain. She moved through the hall like anyone else would, but the air around her moved differently. Some looked away, Not in avoidance, but in reverence. Others looked straight at her, not with awe, but with a quiet kind of respect that doesn't need to be announced. One girl sitting by the window slid her backpack off the adjacent seat. Amira sat down. No one said a word. She didn't smile. She didn't have to. Across the street, in a parked car with peeling paint and a crooked rearview mirror, Lorraine sat in the driver's seat. She hadn't followed her daughter inside. She had promised she wouldn't. But she stayed long enough to see her disappear into the hallway. And in that pause, in that space between stillness and motion, Lorraine let her shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. Her eyes softened. Her hands opened slightly over the wheel, and a quiet exhale slipped from her lungs, like something she no longer needed to hold on to. Downtown on the courthouse lawn, someone planted a sign. Not marble, not grand, just a simple wooden stake and a white painted message. Accountability begins here. No one took credit. No one needed to. Tourists photographed it. Teachers built lessons around it. Organizers stood near it during marches, holding silence like it was a kind of language. The sign didn't shout. It just stood, like the girl who made it necessary. And then a video began to spread. No narration, no commentary, just a slow montage set to a quiet piano. Amira standing between the officer and the old man. Amira sitting still wristbound. Amira watching the courtroom turn against itself. Amira walking through the exit doors, head held high. Then came one last frame. No sound, just a black screen. To every girl told to sit down, you were always meant to rise. People shared the video without adding anything. It didn't need captions. It didn't need debate. Mothers sent it to daughters. Teachers showed it before class. A librarian printed the last line and pinned it beside a shelf of biographies, right beneath the names of women whose stories had once been too quiet to hear. And somewhere far from any courthouse or camera, a girl sat alone in her bedroom reading in the evening light. She had been told once, or maybe 100 times, that her voice was too soft, that her silence made her invisible. But as she watched the clip again, her hands no longer trembled at the thought of being quiet, because maybe silence wasn't what they told her it was. Maybe it wasn't the absence of power. Maybe silence was where power begins. Maybe it was the space between fear and clarity, the place where restraint lives not because someone forced it, but because someone chose it. And maybe, just maybe, strength isn't always the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes it's the only thing that doesn't need to raise its voice. If this story moved you even just a little, take a moment to let it settle. Because what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about law or punishment. It was about dignity. About the quiet strength that lives in people who are told they don't matter and choose to show up anyway. It was about a girl who never raised her voice yet made the world stop and listen. If you believe in stories like this, stories that speak when others fall silent, stories that remind us of who we are and what we're capable of, please tap the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that strength doesn't always shout. And if you haven't already subscribed to Mr. Max Stories, here we don't just tell stories, we tell what silence remembers. Your support helps us keep creating more powerful, human-centered stories that deserve to be heard. Every comment, every share, it fuels the next voice we help uncover. Thank you for being part of this journey. We'll see you in the next story.